She was the Virgin Queen. Gloriana. The monarch who never married, who held back the tide of Catholic Europe, who reigned for 45 years over a kingdom that transformed under her watch. But her final days were not bathed in glory or strength. They were soaked in dread, silence, and a bitter refusal to let go. As Elizabeth I approached the end, she did so without grace or peace. Her body broke down slowly, painfully. Her mind became clouded, haunted by ghosts of the past and regrets never spoken aloud. What unfolded in the winter and spring of 1603 was not the peaceful death of a beloved ruler, but the disturbing, drawn-out decay of a queen who refused to die. By 1600, Elizabeth Tudor was well into her late 60s, an old age for any person in the 16th century, especially a ruler who had endured war, betrayal, plague, and religious conflict. She had become a symbol of stability in a tumultuous world. But she was also something else, a relic. A monarch whose image was frozen in time, while the world around her had changed. Her once vibrant court was fading. Many of the counselors who had guided her through the crises of her early reign were dead. The men she had trusted most, William Cecil, Francis Walsingham, Robert Dudley, had all passed, leaving their sons and lesser men in their place. Elizabeth, who had built her reign on a combination of intelligence, fear, and personal magnetism, now ruled from a place of isolation. Though her mind remained sharp for a time, her body betrayed her. Her teeth were blackened by decay and sugar. Her hair had long fallen out and been replaced with increasingly elaborate wigs. Her skin, once powdered white with lead-laced cosmetics, had turned yellow and papery. Her fingers were twisted with arthritis, and her eyesight was failing. But she refused to appear anything less than immortal. Elizabeth was obsessed with her image. Portraits were painted that bore no resemblance to the crumbling figure behind the throne. They showed her as ageless, regal, unbent. In truth, she was skeletal beneath layers of silks and pearls. She still danced at court, still walked with noble dignity. But behind the velvet and the ceremony was a woman desperately trying to pretend she wasn't dying. The public still adored her. But inside the palace, her ladies and servants whispered. The queen was changing. Her laughter came less often. Her gaze lingered longer on shadows. She seemed afraid of sleep, as if dreams might show her what she could not face awake. In private, she wept. She was not just mourning her age or the loss of friends. She was mourning herself, the legend she had built, the image she could no longer maintain. Elizabeth had never been just a ruler, she had been a myth in human form. But myths cannot bleed. And she was beginning to bleed. In March 1602, Elizabeth suffered a devastating blow. Catherine Howard, Countess of Nottingham and one of her last true confidants, died. Elizabeth fell into a deep depression. She refused food. Refused rest. She sat in dark silence for hours, sometimes days, lost in memories. When courtiers approached her with matters of state, she waved them away or responded with confusion. She had ruled for 4.5 decades, but now, even the smallest decision seemed beyond her. The fire that had driven her all her life, her legendary force of will, was flickering. Worse still, she had no heir. Elizabeth had famously refused to marry, claiming she was wedded to her kingdom. But as her death approached, the consequences of that decision loomed large. Who would rule after her? Who would inherit a crown she had worn like armor? She had delayed naming a successor for years, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of political calculation. But now, with her strength failing, the choice could no longer be ignored. She was hounded by advisers to name James VI of Scotland, the son of her executed cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. It was a bitter irony. Elizabeth had executed Mary to protect her throne, and now that throne would pass to Mary's son. Elizabeth resisted naming him. She resisted discussing the matter at all. As if acknowledging death's approach would summon it. Her physical symptoms worsened. Her legs swelled. Her voice grew hoarse. She experienced chills and fevers. Her appetite vanished. She became convinced she was being poisoned, a fear that had haunted her since the earliest days of her reign. She lashed out at servants. She ordered food thrown away untouched. She refused to take medicine. Her doctors could only watch as the queen shrank before them. She stopped sleeping. For days at a time, Elizabeth refused to lie down. She stood, or sat upright, surrounded by cushions, in a dark room. When asked why, she whispered that she feared she would never rise again. And perhaps she knew. Once the body rests, it begins to surrender. And Elizabeth never surrendered. This was no ordinary decline. It was a psychological unraveling, a monarch trying to cling to power even as her flesh and mind betrayed her. She was not afraid of death in theory. But in practice, she could not accept that the story was ending, and she would not get to write the final chapter. By early March 1603, Elizabeth could no longer walk. Her body, once full of motion even in old age, now refused to cooperate. She was placed in a chair, and there she remained, hour after hour, silent, staring ahead as if waiting for something only she could see. Her eyes, once sharp and commanding, had grown glassy. She no longer responded to her name immediately, and her words, when spoken, came in murmurs or nonsense. Her attendants tried to coax her into bed, but she resisted with what little strength she had. She was terrified of being put to bed, convinced it would mean her death. "This bed is my grave," she allegedly whispered. And she would not enter it. She grew more and more withdrawn. She stopped speaking altogether. She refused water. Refused even to be washed. Those closest to her were reduced to tears, begging her to take food, to sleep, to let them care for her. But Elizabeth had always been stubborn, and now, even in the face of death, she would not yield. Eventually, after nearly 4 days of sitting upright in unbroken silence, she collapsed. Her ladies caught her before she hit the floor. Weak, limp, and no longer responsive, she was finally taken to bed, not by choice, but by necessity. The bed she had avoided became her last throne. What followed was a grotesque vigil. The dying queen lay unmoving, attended night and day. Her breathing was shallow. Her skin was waxen. Her lips turned purple. Her hands trembled. She seemed caught between worlds, neither fully conscious nor completely gone. And still, she clung on. Doctors applied heated bricks to her feet. They bled her in a desperate attempt to relieve what they thought were humors. Nothing worked. The palace was filled with the scent of herbs and decay. Outside, the air was thick with rumor. Elizabeth was dying. And still, she refused to let go. Robert Cecil, her most powerful remaining advisor, paced the halls in dread. The court was frozen, paralyzed by uncertainty. With no named successor and the queen slipping away, the realm was on the edge of chaos. But no one could break the silence in Elizabeth's chamber. And then, one evening, she stirred. She opened her eyes and looked around slowly. Cecil approached her, knelt beside her bed, and asked the question England had been waiting for, "Your Majesty, to whom do you bequeath your crown?" She raised a trembling hand, barely able to lift it. And with a faint breath, she murmured, "To my cousin of Scotland. James VI. The very man whose mother she had sent to the scaffold. Her final political decision, made with what little energy she had left. Then, silence returned. In the days following Elizabeth's final words, the Queen drifted in and out of consciousness. Her chamber remained sealed off from all but her most trusted attendants and physicians. The court held its breath. Outside the palace walls, England waited. On the night of March 23, 1603, Elizabeth's breathing slowed. Her body had been failing for weeks, but now the decline was accelerating. Her skin turned gray, her limbs cold. There were no outbursts, no speeches, no last proclamations. She lay still, eyes half-lidded, lips parted, a silent effigy of the queen she had once been. At around 3 o'clock in the morning, the royal physicians confirmed it: the Virgin Queen was dead. The moment was devastating. Even those who had been waiting, perhaps even hoping, for the transfer of power, found themselves shaken. Elizabeth had ruled for nearly half a century. No Englishman alive could remember a time without her. Now, all that was left was a decaying body in a darkened room. Her corpse was quickly prepared. There was no time to waste, already the signs of decomposition had begun. The cold March air helped slow the process, but the body was still swollen, discolored. Her face, once adorned with powder and rouge, was ghostly pale. Her attendants washed the body, applied perfumes and balms, and dressed her in a ceremonial gown. A crimson wig was fitted. Her eyes were closed. Her hands folded. But no one could deny the truth. Death had left its mark. Outside, word of her death spread fast. Bells tolled across the kingdom. Nobles wept openly in court. Commoners lit candles and prayed. Across the sea, in Scotland, James VI was informed that he was now James I of England. But for many in England, this was not a celebration of a new reign. It was a reckoning. A queen who had ruled with unmatched brilliance had withered before their eyes, and now lay in silence. The royal court began preparations for one of the grandest funerals in English history. Yet even this was haunted by the shadow of her passing. Elizabeth's body was placed in a lead coffin and sealed. A wax effigy was made to rest atop the casket, a smiling image of the queen in her prime, not the corpse within. This lifeless figure was paraded through the streets of London, surrounded by banners and black velvet, as thousands lined the roads. The real Elizabeth, stiff and silent beneath the metal lid, was unseen. Unacknowledged. She was buried at Westminster Abbey on April 28, 1603, nearly 5 weeks after her death. Her coffin was placed in the same tomb as her half-sister, Mary I. Two queens who had been enemies in life, now lay together in death, an eternal irony. Even in burial, Elizabeth remained a myth. Her funeral sermon declared her the Phoenix Queen, rising again in glory. The truth of her death, the long days of silence, the fear, the rot, was erased. But some remembered. Ladies-in-waiting who had watched her waste away. Servants who had heard her mutter in the dark. Doctors who had failed to ease her pain. They knew. And their whispers would carry the true story for generations. The Virgin Queen had not died triumphantly. She had died terrified. When Elizabeth I died, England lost more than a monarch. It lost the living symbol of its power, identity, and independence. Her long reign had delivered stability to a kingdom once racked by religious conflict and civil unrest. Under her, England had seen exploration, art, theater, and political evolution. But her death left a void, and a fear that her legacy might unravel. James I, her chosen successor, arrived from Scotland to inherit a throne not built by his mother Mary's Catholic vision, but by Elizabeth's Protestant steel. He had never set foot in England until her death, and many wondered how a Scottish outsider could step into the shoes of a queen whose very name had become legend. At first, James walked carefully. He kept Elizabeth's ministers in place. He praised her memory. But behind closed doors, the Elizabethan court was dismantled. Her tapestries were removed. Her portraits taken down. Her ladies dismissed. Her personal belongings catalogued, sealed away, or burned. Her name was no longer spoken with reverence in court. It was as if she had never lived. This quiet erasure was not accidental. James wanted to establish his own authority, his own legacy. Elizabeth was too powerful, too mythic. Her memory was a shadow cast over his crown. So he buried her again, not in stone, but in silence. Yet her legacy could not be buried completely. Writers, historians, and dramatists continued to tell her story. Some celebrated her as England's savior. Others whispered about her final days. Rumors circulated for generations, that she had gone mad, that she had been haunted by her victims, that she had confessed to sins on her deathbed. None of it was ever confirmed. But the whispers stuck. Modern forensic studies have suggested that the lead-based cosmetics she used for decades may have slowly poisoned her, contributing to her mental decline and physical decay. Her wigs and white powders, once symbols of majesty, had become instruments of her demise. Her body, turned to sculpture, had been eaten away from within. Her cult of personality lived on. Plays were written in her honor. Churches bore her likeness in stained glass. Coins with her image were hoarded. But beneath the surface, a darker truth lingered. Elizabeth had built an empire with brilliance and fear, but her final years were not golden. They were lonely, tragic, and terrifying. She had outlived her age, and the world moved on without her. In her final moments, she wasn't Gloriana or the Virgin Queen. She was simply Elizabeth, a dying woman, afraid to close her eyes. The silence of her death chamber still echoes in the pages of history. Not because of what was said, but because of what was refused to be said. Her death was not a triumphant ending, but a slow, anguished unraveling. And that is perhaps the cruelest irony of all. The queen who refused to be a woman, who ruled as an icon, met death not as a ruler, but as a human. Helpless. Terrified. Alone. The story of Elizabeth I ends not with fireworks or proclamations, but with the quiet, shaking breath of a woman who had lost everyone, who feared the dark, and who knew, despite her many victories, that even the most powerful among us must eventually fall. Even queens rot.